This morning we are going to be looking at, as Patrick said, this parable of the Good Samaritan. Luke was quite fond of parables. As you know, there's 4 Gospels, and if you're into statistics, in the Gospel of John, my favorite, 0 parables. Gospel Mark, maybe the shortest and the punchiest, maybe only 5 or 6. And then both Matthew and Luke, over 35. So this is just one of them. We've already had about 4. And I think it is good just to know that when Jesus taught in parables, he was in a different culture than we are, and information was given out in a different way. In our culture in the West, we have someone standing up for a lectern, and they give a lecture. And you'll see that's almost everywhere: teacher, students, professor, all of that. And this kind of information is given out in a linear way, and it's supposed to get the right ideas in your head, and then maybe you split them back again. Whereas the parable was a much different way. There was a whole bunch of different types of learners. You probably know, not everyone was educated then, not everyone could read back then, and so Jesus is talking to a crowd, perhaps, and there's a whole degree of different learners. And we think that maybe the parable is just for morality. What's the moral to the story? And whereas it's not always that. Jesus does teach both kind of lessons of morality, but also he teaches us things about God. He does a bit of theology at the same time. So one way of thinking about it is we get invited to someone's house, a large mansion, and there's lots of rooms to explore. And so you go into each room, and maybe there's some books here, and there's some art over here, and it's a well-lit house, there's a lot of windows, and you're looking out over a great city or a great empire, and each time you look out a window, you see something a bit different. So I think that's a better way of us thinking about the parables. It's not as if it's just an allegory. It's not as if there's just one lesson. It's multifaceted. So I think that's a very important thing for us to remember. And then, in addition, this particular one, the one that Yoshi has just read very well, just remember, like the parable is kind of it's the diamond in the ring. There might be 2 small diamonds on every side. What's happening is there's Jesus and there's a lawyer, and they're having a little bit of a skirmish of some kind on one side, and then the parable comes, and then it ends up with Jesus and the lawyer having their little kind of discussion again. And everything we read in the New Testament, of course, is written in a different time and place, and it is best, and I think everyone agrees with this who's read the Bible and wants to understand the Bible, is if we can, try to put ourselves in this crowd. In this particular time, it's probably Jesus and the lawyer were the 2 main people, but there were probably other students, disciples, listeners around, and so we just pretend that we're in that crowd. And if we can, but we can't, try to maybe think of, and I'll mention a few things, some of the norms that they would have all appreciated that maybe we don't get just at the same time. Luke is a doctor. He's obviously somewhat organized to have written this particular story, and there is a structure to it. There's kind of these 2 discussions that I've talked about, and they have the same kind of an order. There's a question by the lawyer, and then there's a question by Jesus, and then there's an answer from the lawyer, and then there's an answer by Jesus. That's the first one. And then in the second half, the lawyer's got another question. He asks a question. And at that point, Jesus tells this story, the parable, and then Jesus has a question for him, to which he gives an answer, and then Jesus finally answers his second question. So let's just sort of go through it a little bit, and One day, an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus. So we've got a little bit of background that Luke gives. This person's question wasn't exactly kind of honest. He had a motive for it. He wanted to test Jesus, trick him up. Maybe he was somewhat jealous of him. And it says here that he stood. And I understand that in those days, Jesus would be the rabbi. They would treat him like that. And what used to happen, much like maybe when you used to be in grade school, the students are all around, sitting, and the teacher is sitting. And the teacher asks questions. And the students, if they had an answer, like we used to do, put up your hand, and then, if you remember, you would stand up, and you would recite your poetry or your answer, you tried to whatever, and then you sit down again. But in this case, this person is a little bit out of sync, so the lawyer is standing up with the question. He's not standing up to give an answer. And he is trying to test Jesus in some matter of the law. And so he has the question, Teacher, Rabbi, what should I do to inherit life? Remember that. It's the first question. What should I do to inherit eternal life? Now, we don't know exactly what the motive is. Apparently, the lawyers back then were interested in this topic, but probably more than anything, he was trying to trip Jesus up. Jesus is going to be quoting from the law, maybe, and he's going to get something wrong, and then he'll be able to find some fault. The other thing to notice, I guess, is that there's something wrong with the question. As you probably know, if you're going to inherit something, as Colin was saying in the earlier service, if you're going to inherit something, you have to be a child. You have to be in the family. You can't go to some family with a lot of assets and someone dies and you want to be part of the inheritance, and so you do something, whatever. Maybe you help with the will, or maybe you whatever, help sell the house, or whatever it is. That's not how inheritances work. If you're going to be an heir, then you have to be part of the family. And so this question is a little bit false just from the get-go. And so Jesus, I mean, he always gets things right, and he's never stumped, and he always seems to have the upper hand. He just sort of says, well, you're the expert. This is your business. You should really know yourself. How do you read the law? How do you read the Torah? So that was, I think that was maybe common back then. You'd answer a question with a question. And so Jesus avoids the trap of having to go into the law and try to get all the individual things that one must do in order to get life. And so the man answers, and he answers with something that probably he had heard before. As we've been reading along in Luke's gospel, this should be somewhat familiar. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind. Well, Jesus had already given that as an answer when someone asked him what was the kind of the summary of the whole law. And that's what Jesus said. And then, of course, love your neighbor as yourself. That's it. There's a story about the two famous rabbis back in Jesus' time who lived a little bit before him, Shammai and Hillel. You might have heard of the Hillel house in different cities. And apparently there was kind of an outsider, and he was trying to maybe make the rabbi look foolish. And so what he did is he got up on one leg like this and said, quickly, could you summarize the whole law for me? and which Shammai really got mad, and he chased him away. So he went over to the other leading rabbi, Hillel, and asked him the same question. And he said, oh, the things that you detest, you hate, make sure you don't do those against other people. That's the whole law. Everything else is just a commentary. In other words, kind of the reverse of the golden rule. So this is his answer. And Jesus says, okay, then I'll answer you now your first question. You've got it right. You've got it exactly right. You just do that and you will live. Everything's fine. That's right. You've got it perfect. You want to know what you have to do to inherit life? Love God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, and you will live. So, I guess there's a question for us here. What do you think? Do you think then that by doing we can inherit eternal life? Jesus seems to say that it's true, and I think, and it is true. There is, of course, a problem, and if you read on in the New Testament, I think you kind of find out what the problem is. And it's kind of like this. It's like, if you can keep those two great commandments to love God with all your heart, your strength, your soul, and your mind, if you can do that, and if you can love your neighbor as you love yourself, quoting from Leviticus and quoting from Deuteronomy, if you can do those things, you're in. But it's, as you probably know just from experience, it's kind of not like that. It's like, well, this is just a very simple illustration, but it's like you're an Olympic athlete and you're really good at climbing and running, and it's like, okay, here it is. There's two fences ahead of you there. They're both 10 meters high. They both have 1 meter of barbed wire at the top, and they're both made of solid glass, quite slippery. And now you're standing 10 meters away from the fence, and it is minus 40 outside. You only got your shorts on and your shirt and your bare feet, and you've got to go to that fence and just get over it. And then, of course, there's another 10 meters, and that's hot coals, desert, plus 40 degrees. You got to run through that, and then you got to get over the other fence. And after that, you get into paradise. It's kind of like that. It's like if you can do all this, you will gain an eternal life. But it's like what Paul said. So if we've read the New Testament, we know that Paul basically says, and it's true, the law is good. We shouldn't try and follow it. The law is perfect. But the problem is with us. We can't actually do it. We can try. You can open your eyes in the morning and you can say, okay, this is the day. And then after a few minutes or maybe an hour, something's gone wrong. Maybe you forgot even about God, Maybe you had to go to the bathroom really, really fast. Maybe the baby's crying. Maybe you're whatever. And you're all of a sudden, you've wrecked that day. So I think that's kind of what Jesus is saying to the man. And the man, I don't think, really gets it. Jesus, I think, has set him up, basically saying, you should know better. You of all people should know, yeah, you can do those things, but do you really think you can do all those things? So now we get to the next set of questions and answers. And so the man, and again, Luke gives us the reason. He wants to justify himself. He wants to prove that he is right before God. And so, he just wants to get some definitions right. He wants to make sure maybe that he doesn't do more than he has to. And probably, in his own mind, he might think he knows how to obey God. He knows all the commandments. He's memorized them from youth. And he probably thinks, he knows all of the things to do in terms of washings and timing of the day and the Sabbath and cleaning. And he probably thinks he knows how to do that he can control himself. So he wonders now about the neighbor part. Like, kind of maybe what's the minimum, or just to make sure that I'm know who my neighbor is. And in the back of his mind, he might be thinking about Leviticus 19, where it's sort of in the verse that it says, love your neighbor, it says, the sons of your family. So maybe it is really only your immediate family who's your neighbor, but of course he is a scribe, he's a lawyer, he's read through all of the Old Testament, and if you read at the end of chapter 19 there, it just says, yeah. And then that foreigner guy, that stranger who's in your land, yeah, that's also part of who you're supposed to be loving. So it's at this point that Jesus starts the story, which is, extremely famous, maybe the most famous, popular of all of the parables. I was at a friend's house, teacher, 50 years old, just sort of a secular Catholic, maybe. Yeah, and I asked him, hey, I'm speaking at church on Sunday. The topic is the parable of a good Samaritan. What do you, hey, tell me all you know about it. And he backed off at first, and eventually, he was able to get a few sentences, and, he got the gist of the story and says, well, I was raised in the Catholic schools system in Montreal. But it is a very, very famous parable. And I just want, again, just to notice, because it is literature, and it is part of what Luke wrote, and Luke knew the Old Testament, and all the people around them were Jews, and they had the Old Testament, and maybe you remember from your studies in literature, Japanese, this haiku, there's a structure, this A, B, 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 iambic pentameter, Shakespearean sonnets, they all have some structure. Well, in these days of Hebrew literature, and a lot of the Old Testament has the structure. For example, Psalm 23 is the structure, and it's like a seven-point structure, 7 scenes, let's say. And 1 and 7 go together. And 2 and 6 go together. Okay? And 3 and 5 go together. And then the main point is 4. Okay? So 1 relates to 7, and 2 relates to 6, 3 relates to 5, and 4 is don't miss 4, because that's the main point. And so, in summary, I think because we've heard it and hope that we all know it, the first scene is this one here. Guy going down, meets some thugs, gets beat up, steals everything, strips him naked, and he's bleeding to death. That's 1. And then 7, the Samaritan, remember? He's in the inn, right? And he's paying money. His 2 denarii are going to last for at least 2 weeks' rent, and he's brought him there at his own expense. He's paying the innkeeper to make sure that there's food and clothing. So all of the stuff he lost in payment, he's getting back. And then 2 is the Levi guy, okay? And he's going down, and he walks across the other side, and then that relates to this other point 6, where the Good Samaritan guy puts him on his own donkey or horse. And he takes him at great expense to himself through Jewish territory, and he goes into a Jewish town at great expense to himself, because he's a Samaritan, and he takes them on his that way. And then 3 and 5 would be the Levites, and they pass by, and the Samaritan man, he actually sees the urgency of the medical need, and he binds up the wounds, he puts in oil, and because he's got to get him somewhere for help, so he does both of the medicine and the surgery, and he gets him on his donkey. And then the main point, of course, is the Samaritan, right? The Samaritan is moved with compassion, and he stops. So anyway, that's just the structure. It's helpful for learning. I find it really, really helpful. So this is it here. this is the story. This is part of most of our stuff that we watch on TV and television. Someone gets beat up bad, probably by the bad guys, and really roughed up. And there's a lot of violence today on TV. This is nothing new. This is what happens here. He's attacked, he's stripped, and they beat him up, and he is going to die. And it says a certain man, but it is clearly a Jewish man who's going down. And I think that's important to the parable, that he's Jewish, and it's important that he's stripped down. And then by chance, a priest comes along. Now, apparently, the priests had a lot of money. They were kind of in the upper class in terms of the salary structure. And the priests there's a hierarchy to do with the temple that we talked about again in the first service. The priests are at the top. They're doing all the fancy work. And the high priest goes into the holiest of holies only once a year. And then there's the Levites who are doing more of the janitorial stuff, making sure that, that the bulls are coming in, making sure things are swept up, making sure that there's water, making sure, that the lights are on. And then the last group would just be the common people. They they come to the temple. So that's the kind of hierarchy in terms of the temple. And the audience would be aware of that. The priests, the Levites, and the people. And so the priest is coming along, and apparently he's a rich guy, and apparently this journey is about 25 kilometers, so it is a day's walk, a good day's walk, and so probably he had an animal, because he's rich, whatever. He had a horse or he had a donkey, because he can afford it, and he might have a little bit of an entourage. Maybe he had some of his helpers kind of behind him. And so the point is, he had the means, at least, to help this man. He had money, and he had transportation, but he had some problems. The man is stripped. So who is he? Well, I don't know. You can't tell, right? I mean, we know each other by our clothing, by how we talk, by the food we eat, all that kind of stuff. And you can't tell because he is naked and he's almost dying. And so the priest might think, well, if he's not a Jew, I can really just go past. But if he is a Jew, and if he's dead, and I put him on my donkey, I'm going to be defiled. That means I'll have to go back to the temple for a whole week and go into cleansing mode before I can sort of get back to my normal life again. And if I touch him and he dies, then there's a whole bunch of other stuff I have to do. So he was thinking in this way, of his own convenience, I guess, and he decided probably best just to move along. And that's what he did. I don't know where the other verse is here. Sorry, there it is there. And then, so one of the Levites also came by, and they maybe were with the priest or not, and it says with them, they did the same thing. They looked at the situation, and they just walked by the other side, and perhaps they had some motives too. They remember, these are the people who kind of do things. They have means, they have food maybe, they're carrying all the stuff the priests need, or whatever the case. They could have done something to maybe give aid, bandages, medicines, food, whatever, water, but maybe they're thinking, well, the priest passed by. Like am I going to show up my boss? Am I going to do something and then, like the coach is really going to get upset because I set a bad example? So anyway, in terms of expediency, they passed by as well. And then this is the point of the whole parable. This is the point 4. And then a despised Samaritan, he comes by. Now, so the Samaritan, he's in foreign territory. If you know anything about the Middle East, then and now, if you are the wrong type of person in the wrong neighborhood, they will kill you. And he happens to be in the same road, which apparently was the road of blood. It was a place where people got beat up a lot. It wasn't a good place for people to travel. And it says of the Samaritan, he has compassion. We don't know why he has compassion, but he has compassion. And in terms of Jesus' story, this is a good thing. And so, unlike the Levites who didn't do anything with their means, he did something. And the order maybe, I'm not a doctor or a surgeon, but you've got to bind up the wound so the bleeding stops, but at the same time there's going to be disinfectants and there's going to be infection in the wounds, so you put in whatever oil and wine or whatever you do. But anyway, he does whatever he can with his medical primitive skills, and he at least stops the bleeding, let's say. And that's maybe something that the Levites could have done. And then, of course, he was a man of means, obviously. He had the medicines, he had his own donkey, and he now, and remember, just try to think of any situation where you're in a culture and there's a different person there. They look different. Whatever. The Jews and the Palestinians, whatever it is, this man is singularly outside of his home space. He's in enemy territory. And so, it'd be much easier for him, for whatever he was doing, just to pass by. But no, he stops. He helps the man. And then he does, and there's not going to be an inn that's really close. It's going to be in Jericho. So he's going to have to go the whole way. And all the while, he's exposing himself to great danger. But he puts the man on his own donkey, and away they go. This is something perhaps that the priest could have done with his donkey or his wealth. And then he went to where there was a place where there is some hospice, some hospital, some hotel, and he took care of him. And then finally, the man was robbed of all he had, money, clothing, health, robbed of the whole thing. And the next day, so he stayed overnight or whatever it was, and the next day he says, okay, I want you to keep this man in a good state of repair, and here's 2 silver coins, which apparently would last maybe a few weeks, and even that, keep them as long as you need to, and if there's more expense, I'm going to now come back into dangerous territory, and I'm going to give you what you need. So here's an example of a man probably doing the miraculous. Try to put yourself in, it's a story, and there's some indication that this maybe happened in the days of the kings, but imagine yourself doing all these things, being in a foreign land, foreign language, where you are not safe. Go some parts of the Middle East, right? If you go there and you're a Westerner, if you're from America, if you're from Canada, you can get in a lot of trouble. You may find yourself in jail and killed. So anyway, I'm just trying to, get to the point that this is a perfect man. This is not just an ordinary man. I don't think I could do this or would do that or could do that. This is the exemplar. This is the perfect neighbor. So the man asks the question, well, who's my neighbor? Jesus now asks his question back. So this is question 4. And Jesus kind of says, you've got the wrong question. It's not who's my neighbor, it's who, what kind of a neighbor are you going to be? It's not a matter of who's your neighbor, but what kind of a neighbor are you? And so he asked the question. Of all the 3 people, which was the person who actually acted neighborly? Who was the neighbor? So the man who was hurt wasn't the neighbor. One of the 3 was, and it's pretty easy. and the lawyer, the doctor, sheepishly gets the right answer. Yep, and he doesn't mention him by name, doesn't mention that he was a Samaritan, because just like remember the whole drama here. You would think it'd be the other way around, that there would be a Samaritan who was beat up by some Jewish thugs, okay? Outsider, and he's in, Jewish territory, and a good Jew, a perfect man, goes and he is the good neighbor. But here it's totally flipped around. It's, right? And especially if it happened in Samaria. So he says, yes, obviously it was the man who actually showed mercy. Doesn't mention him by name, doesn't mention his kind of stripes as being a Samaritan. And Jesus says, okay. And it's the same answer that you get to the very first question, like, what must I do? Love God, love your neighbor. Go ahead and do it, and you're going to live. Who's my neighbor? Okay? Now you go and do it, and you're going to live. So that's the end of the story. Here's just to, like, it's really interesting that, as we've already been stated, this story is in our culture. It's in there. I don't know whether it's in the Middle Eastern cultures, but it's in the Western culture. It's going to be there for a while. This is kind of a little anagram, just sort of the frequency in books scanned maybe in the last 200 years, and the use of this expression, the Good Samaritan. These are just some pieces of art. This is from the 17th century. Rembrandt used this as a theme quite frequently. Here's a woodcut from the 18th century. Again, very intricate kind of depiction of the Samaritan and the man who is naked, and there's oil and there's water going on. Vincent van Gogh, maybe this was drawn like when he was in France, but notice the different style of colors, Impressionism, and that's his rendering. And then if you were to travel to Halifax, where my brother-in-law lives, and if you were to go to, on a Sunday, St. Paul's, which is an evangelical Anglican church. Apparently this is the oldest building, actually, the oldest church building, Protestant church building in Canada that's still standing. So it's there, and if you were to go there, like a lot of Anglican churches, they have sort of a place under the church where people are buried, and they've got different, like if you go to Little Trinity, you see different tombstones of famous people, like on the walls, and you'd find this sculpture here, done by a fellow named Samuel Nixon in 1840. And there is a little bit of a nice little connection with this church and this, what we're studying now. Is this the rector now, I guess, which is the highest guy in the Anglican structure, hierarchy? We're not very good at that. We have a low hierarchy, right? Jesus, we know that one there. He's preeminent, and we'd like to think of ourselves as whatever, as disciples and followers and servants, but in the Anglican Church, their structure is a little bit more up front, and so the rector there is Paul Friesen. Now, I met Paul Friesen when I was at first year university in the early 70s at John Saner's house down on Huron Street. He came for the Bible studies like I did. And then I found out that he actually was associated more with Leaside even before that. In the 60s, he came to live, at least, I think, with the McNabbs. I think he lost his mom, and his dad was obviously needing some help, and so he came and lived with the McNabbs, and so Allison and Paul Friesen knew each other way, way back then. And I think for a time he would have been involved at Mary Magdalene Church, maybe back in the 80s or 90s as well. Anyway, Paul Friesen. This is the old logo of the Scott Mission, which if you ever got the Globe and Mail, you'd always see this. They took it a full ad, and this was the logo there. The logo is the Good Samaritan there, and Christian Ministry of Mercy and Love. So in our city, there are many ministries that are doing good works, right? There's the Followers Mission, there's a Scott Mission, and this particular one, my family's pretty well invested in it. Our church has given money regularly to this outreach on Spadina, so this is not the current building. This is an earlier version of it. If you look on the right, that's like a Chinese funeral parlor, I think. Now, it's still there. But so this is a ministry that's been doing things like the Good Samaritan did for a long, long time. Mr. Zeidman used to be the leader of it. And so you can go down there now, and you meet a lot of people there who are in need of food and shelter and clothing, and these are Christians, and they are giving of their time and money, and we can help sort of with them. If you're a lawyer, you might know that in most Western countries, there is a Good Samaritan Act. It's in law. And this is part of the one, and I'm not a lawyer, but it's in Queen's Park, in our code that we have there. There's a Good Samaritan Act. And I think this clause here basically is saying, when you do go and you try and help someone, don't be afraid if someone's going to take you to jail. That's, I think, basically what this says. But I'm just saying, this thing is so much in our culture, and it's a good thing that it's actually in our laws. And in closing, I just want to think about maybe the big picture, because none of us can be the Good Samaritan. None of us can be that neighborly. And so we need help. And the Gospel of John opens up with these great words, and this is one of them, which we need to memorize and really get into our minds and our hearts, that the Word, who's Jesus, he becomes human. Right? The incarnation. He comes down where all of the people who think they can get to heaven by works are. He goes down to the place where there's a lot of people who are just so desperate they need someone to put in medicine and food and money. And he comes down because his followers, they admit they can't do it. They can't do it. They're honest, and they come to Jesus and they say, I can't do it, but you've done it for me. You've actually been the Good Samaritan. And so in that allegorical sense, I think the theology part is there. Certainly we are to be good neighbors. We can't be perfect, but Jesus is our neighbor. He's the one who is neighborly. Think about that he came down and he became that perfect neighbor. So I'm just going to end it with that. I'm encouraged whenever I hear little stories about, I heard a story quite a while ago about one of our numbers, and there was a guy way out in Scarborough, I don't know, maybe after some crusade, and he wanted a Bible, and so someone got in his car, drove all the way to Scarborough and knocked on some unknown apartment and maybe gave him a Bible, right? There are people going and visiting elderly people who maybe have Alzheimer's and they don't know who they are, just visiting them and trying to help them. There are people in hospitals who are not in their right mind, who might be dangerous, and they call and they want help. And so people go, there's bins at the back. I guess I'm saying that it is really good for us to be neighborly. It is good for us to remember that it's easy just to cross over on the other side. That's the easiest thing to do. And you can get along with your day and with things that you know that you have to be doing. But in the end, the lawyer should have known, and I think we know if we're following Jesus, that we can't gain eternal life by doing it. We can't. Good as good intentioned as one might be, you cannot do it because the standard is just too high. Look at the standard only of being a neighbor. Jesus didn't get into what it meant to love God with all your heart and mind and soul. So I just want to leave it at that. Thank you for listening. It's great that we can be challenged by the Word. It's great that we can rely on the Spirit to help us. Let's just close with a little bit of thought and a little bit of prayer. Father, you sent Jesus into this world as a child, and he grew up, and he grew in stature and favor with you, and he grew up and he knew the law, and he memorized the law, and he was able to follow the law perfectly, and he endured all of the failures of the law from people like us. He endured it right to the very end. That was part of his mission. And so we thank you that you've opened our eyes to see that we can't do it. We can neither be the neighbor, and we admit that we are much, much more like someone who is on the road who needs help, and we just can't help ourselves due to circumstance, bad choices we've made, various addictions, evil things we've done or actions, whatever it is, Lord, you know them all, and we who belong to you, we love you. Thank you for this church. Help us to work out our salvation with fear and trembling, and thank you for these lessons we have through the Gospels. Amen.